Excellent. Right. Okay. Well, welcome to this final session of the day of the virtual school on campaigning and communities, new approaches in planning. For those of you who don't know who I am, I'm not Rob Lloyd-Sweet, who's going to be giving our presentation shortly. I am Chris Reynolds, the Historic Buildings Officer for Surrey County Council, and also the Surrey representative on the IHBC South East Branch. And I am absolutely honoured to be here chairing this session on campaigning and communities. Before we start with Rob's excellent presentation, I'd like to take everyone back in time to the exciting year of 2011, when the world was a very different place. Prince William was enjoying his final night as a bachelor before marrying Kate Middleton. Adele's Someone Like You spent 5 weeks at #1 in the charts, and President Trump was just a running joke in The Simpsons. But something much more significant was brewing under David Cameron's coalition government in the form of the Localism Act being led by Minister Eric Pickles. And this had a huge impact on heritage planning across England. And today we'll be looking at the impact of it, as well as other initiatives which have occurred since then. And the format of today's session is going to be more like a traditional seminar. So we're going to start with a presentation from Rob before we get into the detailed conversation of where we are in heritage planning. I'm delighted to introduce my fantastic panel that I've got here today. First of all, Rob Lloyd-Sweet, who is going to give us his presentation to kick off the session. Rob is a historic places advisor for Historic England, whose duties include providing advice on local plans, neighbourhood planning, conservation area management, as well as offering advice on bids for Heritage Action Zone funding. Following Rob's presentation, we're then going to be joined by our other eminent heritage community and planning experts to discuss the impact of localization, look at what has worked well, but also look at what we should be doing differently. And for that reason, I'm particularly delighted that we've got Terry Leventhal here, the CEO of the Cockburn Association, which promotes good planning to protect the amenity and heritage of Edinburgh, as well as its surroundings. Terry is also a board member of Historic Environment Scotland. So I'm hoping, Terry, you're going to be able to give us a much more different perspective from a different planning system, and perhaps you can tell us what we should be doing to change our current system. I'm equally delighted to also have Joe O'Donnell. Joe is the director of the Nationwide Amenity Society, the Victorian Society, who campaigned to save the Madeira Terrace in Brighton. So as an incredibly relevant organisation to have here today. But not only is Joe incredibly knowledgeable for his campaigning, but he also spent time as the head of policy to the Heritage Alliance. So Joe, I think you're going to be able to offer us a whole range of opinions here today. I do have to offer one apology. We were hoping to have Jess Steele join us, but unfortunately she's had to pull out due to an emergency. But I'm hoping we'll be able to get her involved at some point in the future, either as perhaps some of the tours or perhaps as a future event for the South East Branch. So as a result, we do have a very male-orientated panel, which wasn't our intention. So I hope you can forgive us, and people in the future will forgive us as well. On that note, I'm going to mute myself and hand over to Rob. And Rob, you can tell us all about localization and what changes we've had since 2011 and the Localism Act.
Great, thanks, Chris. Okay, I start off with a little bit of explainer about the word localization, because it's not actually in the English dictionary. It's in the American dictionary with a Z, but it's a term I've been using, I think, for the last 10 years, really to sort of sum up what localism has become or became. And the idea is it's a mixture of other terms. So we've got some globalization, we've got centralization, so we must have something that does the opposite, and that becomes localization. But so that is sort of doing things locally by local people in a locally specific way. And that's one of the things that's come out of this movement. But the other is a hint towards mobilization and the use of local people en masse to achieve a greater outcome. And that's something that I think we've seen in the government policy that was part of localism and the big society. And what we're going to be talking about today is really something that's come out of that, that's actually stuck and is taking root in the way we do planning. So This all isn't something that's come in overnight. Other things that people have in communities have done planning in the past. It's not a brand new initiative. The photos here, the cover of the Village Design Statement Guidance produced by the Countryside Commission back in 1996, when I think I'd just about finished GCSEs. So the community have been encouraged to create guidance that will affect planning. But actually at that time, although we got a lot of these documents, and actually a lot of them are quite good, they weren't necessarily powerful. They weren't given teeth at the time. So what happened in 2011? Well, we got the Localism Act. That created neighbourhood development plans, which are something that apparently has teeth. And this has fed into greater awareness of the concern that communities have about the quality of design of development. This, I think, has sort of pushed forward in the new government's or the post the Conservative Liberal coalition government, a greater concern that NIMBYism as a concept is something that we shouldn't really talk about, because the community are the people who are going to receive development. But we still want the development to happen, and if it doesn't suit the needs of that community, those communities, then that is going to be held up in the process. So we end up with something like the Building Beautiful Commission that justifies the need to actually improve development design. And I love this little quote that was included in it, that beauty doesn't just lift the spirits, it stops them from falling, and thus we need development that actually suits the needs of communities. An interesting outcome of this was that in terms of the desires of the population as a whole, when you ask people what kind of development do you like, what do you want the character of it to be, its appearance to be, conservative with a small c is the majority view, certainly, but conservative with a small c is also more popular to people at a lower economic bracket. And that's more of us than at a higher economic bracket, actually, obviously. So the more money you have, effectively, the more willing you are to see exciting, innovative design. The less money you have, the more you're more comfortable with something that is conservative in its appearance. Obviously, in the National Planning Policy Framework, which came out shortly after 2011, the importance of design guidance was noted. The fact that that could be included in these neighbourhood plans that we've identified, and that would then build on the information from all those village design statements that have been being prepared since the mid-90s. That has now moved on in NPPF 2019, and as a result of Building Beautiful, into a greater focus on design codes. And that's something I'll just mention a little bit more later on when we get around to it. But this is where things are moving. Communities get more of a say in what things should look like, and they've been given neighbourhood plans as a way of doing it. So what are they? Lots of you may have heard of them, but not really know what they do. They are not village design statements. That's the first thing to get in. They have the same legal weight as a local plan. They can actually overwrite parts of the local plan, except for its strategic policies. They have a streamlined process, so they're much easier to produce than a local plan. Doesn't mean that they're easy to produce, they're just easier. And they only have to address those issues that the community want them to, within some limits. So they don't have to cover the full remit of planning issues if the community are content for the local plan and the NPPF to cover those instead. So they don't have to, for example, allocate sites for development. They have to meet some basic tests, and I put the list up here. You can download this as a recording later on if you want to read what they are. And then they are examined by an independent examiner, who is someone commissioned from an organisation called NPERS, set up by various bodies, but including RICS. And they are not the same as the PINS, the Planning Inspectorate's examiners. They are a separate body of people brought from various sectors of life, but with sufficient skills to be able to examine a plan. And probably the most important for today in terms of these basic conditions are that they have to have appropriate regard to our national policy, so the NPPF, and of course the Planning Listed Buildings and Conservation Areas Act. And they have to be in basic conformance with the local plan's strategic policies. And then once they've got to that point and an examiner has said, yes, they do meet these basic conditions, or perhaps they will if you adopt my suggested recommendations, they then go to a referendum and the whole local community get to vote on it. And it's impressive the number of these that get past referendum, not only get passed, but with a enormous majority. So normally somewhere in the 80 to 90% bracket of people voting for them. Some statistics on their current prevalence. These are from MHCLG, Ministry for Housing, Community and Local Government, but based on December last year. I know, as I say, there are some 998 made plans. I know by Christmas they had actually got to 1,000. And last month, on the day we all voted in the local elections, we had another 200 go to their referenda, and most of those will now have been made. So we've got at least 1,200 made plans, I think, in the country as a result. You can see from the map, this very kindly produced by Mr. Ed Dade of Neighbourhood Planning Services, that they're not evenly spread. They're not necessarily confined to commuter belt. There are particular pockets of very active districts who have supported their communities particularly, but there is definitely an area that runs from the Cotswolds, I would say, and Herefordshire down through Sussex that is very, very active. You can see North Devon not so much, South Devon and Cornwall a lot, and then up through the Midlands, but not into the Fenlands particularly. The southeast is particularly busy. I've said on here there's 578 plans in progress in the southeast and 264 that at least have made it past examination. Now that's compared to, we have I think 72 district councils or producing local plans in the southeast. Nearly all of these will cross my desk at least 3 times in their process. So there's a lot of casework involved in dealing with these. But I hear everyone saying, well, what are they? They can't really do much, do they? Not terribly ambitious, and they probably are NIMBYist charters, aren't they? Well, University of Reading have looked at this and said, no, they are fulfilling housing need. They don't necessarily go very much beyond what is required by the independently assessed need. But if you look at the 135 that they use in a particular study, providing 24,000 homes on 480 sites, 4 sites per plan on average, each of those sites delivering 52 homes. That's a lot of housing units, that's a lot of land being developed as a result of these. And those if you look at where that map showed that concentration, that's a lot of rural landscape that's being affected, lots of small villages, most of which are conservation areas, most of which have at least a grade 1 listed building, which is normally the church, and probably a couple of grade 2 stars, but lots of other heritage as well. So there's definitely the potential for an impact. And I just included, this is the cover of Planning Review for a particular article about a neighbourhood plan in Farnham, where a developer was refused permission to build their development. That went to the inspectorate. And was going to be approved, but the neighbourhood plan was made in the interim. Secretary of State called it in and said, no, neighbourhood plan has provided the site that's needed to provide the housing for the town. This site is going to affect a heritage asset. In that case, it was Farnham Castle. It's in the countryside, in an area that the neighbourhood plan has identified as a heritage asset because of its contribution to the setting of the castle, and therefore I'm not going to allow your 65 homes on this site. So what can they actually do to conserve heritage? They can create local lists. Now, local lists are very popular with our minister at the moment. They are seen as a way of local communities being able to identify heritage that matters that may not make it through the long and arduous process of listing. And we're seeing quite a lot of these. I've used the example here of Dorchester. This one appeared in Context a few months ago. Malcolm Ayres, who happens to live in Dorchester-on-Thames and was part of the process, wrote that article. And here we go. it includes some interesting things. So the usual, as you can imagine from a local list, it includes a number of buildings, but it also includes several areas as well. So local lists can be buildings, but they can also be anything else that's a heritage asset. Within this, they identified an area on the edge of their conservation area that they felt could be considered for conservation area status in the future. This is Overy, and it's the area that includes lots of cob walls, lots of vernacular buildings, and because as a neighbourhood plan group they can't insist that the council protect this as a conservation area, they used an area-based designation in their neighbourhood plan to protect that as a future conservation area, but giving it consideration through planning policy. They also identified an adjacent area that has a particularly high amount of Roman archaeology underneath it, and that became a locally listed thing too. Doing a quick sort of survey, I did this earlier today, it looks like I've put 7 out of 22 South Oxfordshire neighbourhood plans include local lists. This is the made ones. So those are the ones that have already made it through the process. I am seeing an increasing number across the southeast region, certainly, of plans that include local lists. There is a visual gag in this, by the way, that 7 out of 22 is pie, and the shop is selling pies. It became a local list in the Benson neighbourhood plan. As well as actually putting things on a local list, the great value of the plans is that they can include the information about what it is that the community considers to be significant and make that part of the process that has to be considered in the planning. So where local listing doesn't necessarily have the teeth that listing does and is very much dependent upon the information it includes, the community therefore have the opportunity here to provide that information and be influential. They don't always. Another thing that you can create for your neighbourhood plan is local green space. Local green space is defined in the NPPF. I won't go into the long description of it, but one of the criteria that you can include local green space under is historic interest. So lots of green spaces within settlements or near them that have historic interest. An example from the Lewes neighbourhood plan, which also made it into context, is a large part of the Lewes registered battlefield site. Now, it's a local heritage thing, surely it doesn't have any teeth. Actually, this gains the same level of protection as Greenbelt. So it's a really powerful way of protecting something the community value, at least for the 15 years that the plan is in act. I provided the example on the other side. This is from Weston on the Green neighbourhood plan in Cherwell, which includes a mixture of the light green areas, which are landscape setting and open views surrounding a conservation area. So there they've defined the setting of the conservation area, at least as far as these green fields make an important positive contribution to it. And then the light blue areas are their local green spaces. They did actually suggest rather more in their original plan, but the examiner considered some of those to be not fulfilling the criteria. So things have to make it through a process of review and consideration and examination to get there. But once they get there, they have quite a high level of protection. They can also provide site-specific design guidance to protect heritage assets. This example, this site that's identified through the Odium and North Warnborough neighbourhood plan is called Land East of Hook Road, and it was allocated to provide 15 houses after a previous planning application was turned down, refused, went to appeal and the appeal upheld. That was for 30 houses on this land. It lies within the North Warnborough conservation area, but also within the Basingstoke Canal conservation area where the two cross over. And a very interesting appeal decision, this one, where the inspector had to consider the impact on both conservation areas that were in fact in the same place, but designated for different reasons. This one has come back for another application that still didn't satisfy the design parameters created or provided by the allocation policy and has been turned down very, very recently again, and we'll see what happens with that. But what it does show is that the community can identify the way they want to see the development delivered that takes into account the needs of the heritage assets that are there, and that can be very influential in determining whether a planning application in the future is successful or not. The majority also include very general character policies. A criticism perhaps of neighbourhood plans is that the policies that they provide tend to be unambitious. They don't very often go much further than restating what's in the NPPF or in the local plan. But what they do have the opportunity to do is use those village design statements, the character assessments that have been done, and give them weight in planning decisions by having attached policies that hook them into a neighbourhood plan. Some go further and have more detailed design policies and codes. And this is the first one, the Chatham Arches Neighbourhood Plan, or Arches Chatham Neighbourhood Plan, which has a very detailed design code. Now, there's a query whether what is a difference between design guidance and design code. The answer, I think, at the moment is code. If you can demonstrate you've complied with it, then you are effectively saying that that's it, we've done enough design, whilst a guidance is always up to the decision maker to decide whether you've actually followed the process through. There's a change in balance of power effectively. But a lot of the codes that we're seeing come across very much as guidance. The Arches Chatham one, I think, is slightly different. As well as all that general stuff, you can again be site specific and actually look at the heritage asset that's within the site. So actually, rather than thinking, I want to develop a site next to a heritage asset that needs to be protected, how about pick a site with a heritage asset in it and say, I want to see this developed to bring it back into a positive use. Now, on our website, we include this as a good study, good practice example. This is the former Aston Martin works, the very old version of it, in Newport Pagnell. So this is where the first Lagondas and things were built. It was actually built in the early 20th century as a carriage works. You can see the Salmon Motor Carriage Works. This had fallen into disuse, was bought by Tesco's, who were going to knock the whole lot down and build a big Tesco's. They decided they weren't going to build more supermarkets and sold it to a housing developer. And in the meanwhile, the neighbourhood plan group put it in their plan and allocated the site for housing, but on the basis that any development that took place would have to secure the future conservation of this building and 2 others that go with it. That was then secured when their planning permission was given through a Section 106 agreement. And then actually development happened. Developers didn't do the work and were in breach of their Section 106 agreement for a short while, but then found a buyer who would do the work for them. And I've been in contact with the conservation officers in Milton Keynes who are very happy with the progress that has now been made on bringing these buildings back into use, and have said, although they won't say who, that there is a potential or a very interested buyer in this property to come up soon to put it back into a new use. So that's a great outcome for an unlisted building in a conservation area that is very specific to the interest of that place, very important to the history of Newport Pagnell as the place where high performance cars were developed. Similar, but in the countryside, this is the Hodson's Mill in Robertsbridge, and this was at the centre of a large development site that became quite contentious, but has now again had a big planning application put in for lots and lots of houses around this that will bring this very difficult mill building back into use. That was a requirement of the planning permission, and again that's going to have to be written into a legal agreement to make sure that that happens before too much more of the site is developed. Neighbourhood plans can also, and many do now, identify key views that the community value, and these can be views that include heritage assets. I did show you a picture from UELM earlier. I'd say that's one of the best practice examples I've seen, because what really matters with these is the information you provide. Now, how much information do you give to the decision maker about what's important within that view? A really nice example from this is Farringdon in Oxfordshire, where the monument you can see on the top of the hill is probably the most distinctive thing about Farringdon. The circle of trees that were planted to surround it in the 20th century are now very mature and rather beautiful. The local plan, so the neighbourhood plan, identifies the monument and the views of it as terribly important, but then also allocates that ring of trees and the green space next to it as local green space to protect the setting of the monument as well. So that, I think, draws together the heritage asset and its setting and gives that setting a legal protection beyond the listing of the monument itself. We have provided advice. We have a website, a web page that then has various pages that come off of it with things like case studies and directions to other information. And I got our web team to find out, actually, does anyone look at it? And I was really pleased to see that they do. So we had over 700 visits last year. We're not able to collect data since February because the change in law on cookies and things. But it's really interesting that what people, as well as downloading the big advice document that we produce, they want to go and look at those case studies, which is what we've always heard in the past. So we produce them, and it's really gratifying to see that people are looking at case studies on what other places have done to protect heritage assets. We produce our big book on how to do it as well, which is really the culmination of 3 Historic Places Advisors' experience of the common issues that we have had to help neighbourhood plan groups resolve, particularly understanding what the historic environment is. Does it go beyond listed buildings and conservation areas? And what are conservation areas and that sort of thing? How can I find out more? Then understanding about those things, what is significance? How do you develop an evidence base? How do you identify issues? That's a particularly difficult one. And then turning that as an understanding into things that might become policies and how to write those. So if you're uncertain, if you have a group come to you as a conservation officer perhaps, or a consultant, and think, what advice can I give them? This is a really useful starting point, because it gets into technical detail, but it's written in a more, I hope, approachable manner than some of our more industry focused documents. So that's the end of neighbourhood plans. And this is where I get onto things that Jeff Steele might have talked about, and some of the other work that we've been doing with communities. Now, about 4 years ago, we started a programme of heritage action zones, and we invited councils and communities from across the country to nominate their town or place and ask to become a heritage action zone, where we would pool the resources of the various departments of Historic England to have a focused impact on a single place. Now, 2 of these, out of the first tranche of 20 that came from the southeast, one was Ramsgate, which was one of the first batch. Ramsgate was really important because it was the only one in that first batch that was nominated by a community organisation. In fact, it was a partnership of Ramsgate Town Council, Ramsgate Society, and the Ramsgate Coastal Community Team. And we've been working with them through various initiatives over the last 3 years in Ramsgate. And one of the lovely sort of little ones that we did was this leaflet with the Ramsgate Society, because back in 2017, we did our survey that discovered that lots and lots of people support the idea of conservation areas, but don't know they actually live in one. And so the Ramsgate Society said, oh, go on, we'll be a trial. We'll create a model leaflet that anyone could adapt for their conservation area, and then we'll make sure it gets delivered to every household in that conservation area. And Ramsgate is a very big one. So I think they produced some 20,000 copies of this leaflet. It's 4 pages long, it's very brief and to the point, and that's intentional. It's not trying to be a conservation area appraisal or even an owner's guidance. It's there for information, just to let people know that this thing exists and that it matters. So they did that. That's available as a template from us if you are interested, if you have a community group who think we'd like to do something similar, just to raise the awareness across an area that the controls exist. That same group also coordinated the volunteers who have gone out and used the good old Oxford Conservation Character Assessment Toolkit to characterize that conservation area. That's provided a lot of survey material, which has now gone into a conservation area appraisal being written up by Alan Baxter Associates with our funding, and that's coming off the presses pretty soon. I'm really pleased that it's taken a long time to go from the initial survey work and then being taken off to do other things, but that actually is going to be available as a draft document, I think, for consultation fairly imminently. The other one of these in the southeast, Stokes Bay, was more conventional, I would say, conservation heritage action zone, identified by or applied for by the district council. But we have been working with Gosport Society and others very closely. In a particular example, Stokes Bay, we have a very recent research report from Historic England that looked at the history and archaeology of this area. But we then worked with the community to look at assessment of designation for new conservation area, and included within that working with one of the local schools. This resulted in, I think, probably the largest response to a conservation area consultation I've seen, we had over 500 responses to consultation on should this be a conservation area from an area that didn't have any houses in it. So it's fantastic that the community have actually got very involved with that as a potential part of their environment that is going to be better looked after in future. Off the back of Heritage Action Zones, we started the Heritage High Street Heritage Action Zone initiative, and we went out to with a big wad of money from the government, did a big call out, who would like to be a Heritage High Street, and we were expecting to look at 40 areas. In the end, we had such a big demand, we had to go back to the government and say, can we have some more money? And they gave us another £45 million and said yes. So we now have 68 of these. And the target for these is, although they are Heritage Action Zones, they're very specifically looking at growth or revival of the economy of our town centres and housing delivery. And it can be and or housing delivery. So if some areas of town centre we feel are never going to become commercially successful again, this is very much a push to say, okay, let's use those historic buildings or those vacant sites within conservation areas and let's deliver housing. Heart of Hastings is one of our key partners. They were the applicant for Hastings rather than the District Council, and they're one of 5 nationally of High Street Heritage Action Zones that is community-led. The other 2, or 2 others, are on the Isle of Wight, and I'll talk about them in a minute. And I'm not sure where the others are. I think one is in Bath and North East Somerset, and one in Cheshire. So they are a community interest company. They set up a community investment fund with our funding, so that people can apply to them with a good idea, and they can decide with a steering group whether or not to fund it. And that's allowed them to spend a lot of money on heritage-focused projects within that part of Hastings. And it's a very focused area within the middle of Hastings. It's included major engineering works to stop the cliff behind the town centre falling down and destroying lots of buildings. It's also allowed direct investment into historic buildings that are going to be used for community use and housing, and lots of events, including their Independence Day. They also bought the Sussex Observer building that's been on our at-risk register for a long time and are doing work to that. And then the 2 on the Isle of Wight, both also applied for by Town Council and a Community Council, doing great things. An example of this, I'm going to the opening of the first phase of Department, which is a former department store that had been closed for about 10 years on Cross Street in Ryde. That is now going to be a fantastic community arts centre. Newport, also, actually more of a civic and education focus for their High Street Heritage Action Zone, bringing education into the High Street. But their focus building is this wonderful Grade 2-star Guildhall by John Nash, where we're using our resources for research, architecture and grant funding to support the community in getting more cultural use out of it, but potentially seed funding opportunities for bigger grants further down the line.
Rob, can I give you just excellent? I was just going to give you a minute to wrap up, and that was excellent timing. Well done. that was spot on, exactly what I was hoping. Rob, I think that was a fantastic presentation. Get yourself a glass of water quickly, and now we're going to grill you. I think that was absolutely fascinating, and reminded me of the term big society, which I'd actually totally forgotten about. It's disappeared a bit as a term more recently, I think. But maybe it will come back. And what looked like a wonderful picture of thatched walls. Maybe I missaw that in one of the slides.
Coped walls.
Is that what it is? Is that what they look absolutely wonderful. You asked the question, do neighbourhood plans have teeth? And I think you've sort of answered that to some extent, which is in some instances yes, and can have a really sort of significant impact. Before I sort of turn to Terry and Joe, I just wanted to ask you one very quick question, because a lot of the neighbourhood plans we've looked at, there's a lot of rural-ish areas, some towns, or sort of reasonable places like Farnham, but inner cities, places like Sheffield or maybe Derby, or sort of bigger places. How do you give voices to the people there?
It has been. This is me, is it? It's been difficult, and it's an area that the government have realised it doesn't work as easily. You do need a well-connected community who are willing to accept a steering group who may not be elected, as their representatives. Now, Headington and Summertown, I included a photo of Summertown in Oxford, have big neighbourhood plan areas with lots and lots and lots of houses in their city, suburban, but not necessarily in a city. So they've got a lot of, you can imagine Oxford has a lot of opportunity for that sort of neighbourhood planning, because you've got a very, very educated populace who are willing to work together and are engaged and used to being powerful. And I think that's the thing. It's one of the most litigious cities in the country because the community have access to power. And that is the difference, I think, with inner city areas. And New Milton neighbourhood plan in Portsmouth has been working away for quite a long time with a community group who feel very unpowerful, I'd say. They've got key buildings that they want to see protected, and they're finding it very slow progress, and partly because when they've gone out to consultation, there's been deafening silence in return. So they've said less than 14% of their populace replied to a consultation on a
Yeah, I mean, that was one of the things I was going to lead on to, really, which is, do you think that this is more about getting the same voices over and over again in planning, or are we actually getting in touch with new people in new areas that want to engage? I hope that's not too pessimistic a question.
No, I think we are hearing a lot of the same voices. They are people who have worked very hard for a long time, though, and I think that's something to bear in mind. I don't think people didn't start off at the age of 60 years old as a retired production engineer. And interestingly, it's the people who have a past in process that are interested in doing this, where I think people expected this to be something that lawyers would get very involved in as retirement projects. It's very much sort of people who have done process-driven things where they've had to try and work out how to solve a problem. So we are gaining the benefit of a lot of people who have spent time thinking about issues and are very engaged with their area. Now, yes, the issue is that we're not getting the younger voice, largely. That's the difference. And I think what we'll see as a result of the past year is online engagement becoming more important as part of it, and that will bring people in. So it's easier to put the kids to bed and join an evening consultation session online, in my experience, necessarily, than going down to the village hall. And if you're doing it across a big suburb, you can do an online survey more easily, and you might hit more people. But it's creating awareness is the real difficulty, I think, in inner city, because there is so much else going on. It's a very busy environment.
On that one, I'm going to turn to Joe. Joe, so obviously you've got a huge amount of experience both campaigning as the Victorian Society, but also you've got a great amount of experience working with policy in your previous role at the Heritage Alliance. Do you think that localization or localism has given more power to local communities, or is that just to a small set of communities who have the time and the resources and the power to do it?
Well, I think it's very hard for me to give an overarching answer, because for starters, I wasn't in the heritage sector before 2010, for one thing. So it's very hard for me to give an overarching view of how things have changed. But my view is very strongly, I think it's kind of the underlying issue, and what Bob was saying there is that it is only a kind of small section of society who have real access to these tools. And there's a very underlying class dimension to it. And I think that perhaps isn't explicitly recognised enough. I think perhaps the government, with its levelling up agenda, is kind of inching towards that. But so I was quite surprised that I saw in Rob's presentation one of the examples being from Chatham, because I'm from Medway, and that's certainly not someone that's kind of overflowing with retired professional people. So and I noticed that it had been supported by Create Streets. So that I think that was quite an interesting insight there, that to get involved in these places, you need kind of coordinated support from outside. And the other thing that struck me really, as Rob was making his presentation, thinking back to 2010 and all the other kind of changes that were going on there, is localism. I kind of been thinking about this in advance, and I'm thinking about, well, there seems to be two kind of opposing forces going on at the moment. One is kind of giving greater say to local communities and local people and kind of empowering them. But at the same time, there's a big kind of push towards deregulation and permitted development. But it struck me during Rob's talk there that perhaps actually it's two sides of the same coin. And what's actually been done is the government's kind of cut resources for kind of local authorities and taking away huge numbers of kind of conservation officers and all that expertise, and kind of shoved it out for local communities to do this work that perhaps once upon a time would have been done at a local government level. And yeah, I feel like it's spotty, and it's done where there's strong local groups and there's the money and the engagement we need to do it.
I mean, to sort of build on that, Joe, obviously the Victorian Society do a lot of campaigning. You're obviously a charity as well, so if people are interested in Victorian Society's work, please by all means do.
Please do.
Go and look them up.
We're a lot at the moment, so yeah, expense it as a professional expense.
Yep, managed to get a plug in for you. So do you find yourself as a campaigning organisation often working with local groups? Is that how you find yourself being more successful in places such as Madeira Terrace in Brighton, or do you still find it's the one member of the public who tips you off, and then you're the lone voice trying to save a church or a I don't know, factory or something?
I think it can really vary, and I think again it comes down to the area. So I think somewhere like Madeira Terrace is if I remember rightly, it's a while back now. I think there's more, as we said, there's more community organisation in somewhere like Brighton, but somewhere where it's a kind of somewhere less salubrious up in the north, it might just be one person. So I think we do try and work with communities where possible, because obviously having more people involved in a campaign amplifies your voice, and it's something that we're always keen to work with communities. And also, obviously, as we said, we're a charity, so there's a limit on what we can do, and we also have to think slightly about our reputation. So we won't necessarily put our neck on the line for a kind of unlisted building, which might be really important for a local community, because although it's not nationally important, it might be the best building in the local area. So we also try and empower them and give them kind of advice and how to take things forward themselves as well.
Okay, I'm going to turn to Terry now. Terry, you're here for our difference perspective, a perspective from a different planning system. And we've had an excellent question in, which is, do you have any thoughts on the similarities and differences between the sort of neighbourhood plans that Rob's been discussing and also local place plans? Also, if you could perhaps tell us a bit more about them, which is what you have in Scotland.
Yeah, it was really fascinating to kind of hear that, because an awful lot of the things that Rob kind of presented, we just don't have in Scotland. Because we don't have local listing, never had. We don't have a heritage action zone process, although there were some attempts to bring it in. And it was only in the 2019 Planning Act that kind of passed through that the concept of a local place plan, which is what they're called, was introduced, but they still don't exist because they were never enabled in the Act. And the Scottish Government have just launched a consultation going through to talk about what they should do and what they shouldn't do going forward, because I think simply and perhaps maybe unfairly, they simply don't know what they're meant to be doing anyway. Because I think that the introduction of them through the kind of Planning Act really, I think, covered Joe's point of, whilst we've seen deregulation and the stripping back from the statutory planning system from a more centralised perspective, there's a recognition that you can perhaps obviate and mitigate against some of those kind of issues by creating these local processes. In Scotland, the kind of drive towards community empowerment has really come from a landowning perspective, which has been driven, for those kind of following it from the big rural kind of land things, from the Aston Crofters to the Isle of Egg communities and the like. And that's where we've seen the drive through the Land Reform Act of 2003, then in the Community Empowerment Act, which very much created the framework for asset transfers. So the initial driver in a Scottish context wasn't about producing locally based policy vehicles. It was about shifting assets into community ownership. And it's quite interesting, that kind of link, again, coming back to the point about the inner city zones, is it isn't generally appreciated that 82% of Scotland lives in cities or large towns. We think of it as a rural, remote community, but it's not. But that's some of the political focus that's tended to be in place, which in many ways is skewed where actually the need for the kind of local resourcing needs to be put into kind of place. And that's been one of the kind of challenges that we've seen. Over and above that, there's a lot of other mixtures that come into it. So certainly one of the aspects of the Community Empowerment Act was to seek to improve the community planning process and community planning partnerships. Now, I'm a bit of a cynic, but these community planning partnerships had little to do with the community and even less to do with planning. They were really about a resource allocation in between local enterprise companies, local authorities and the like. And so the consultation we're beginning to see from the local place plan is the Scottish Government attempting to figure out how an LPP lands within this myriad framework of other statutory plans and compliance documents. So how it relates to the National Planning Framework, which is basically the Scottish Government's local plan, to locality plans, which is the community planning partnership vehicles, to the local outcome improvement plans, which all local authorities have to have because they have to be doing things better, not forgetting the new local development plans that are coming in place. So these conversations are taking place as we speak. So it's really interesting to see the comments are coming out from it. But there's two dimensions to perhaps kind of sum up, which have merged through the process of consultation in the kind of last Planning Act. The first one was resourcing. Now, one of the things that was taking place frequently was the use of design charrettes to help communities begin to articulate what they kind of wanted to do and what they wanted to see. And the average cost of a decent design charrette was about 15,000 quid. And the local place plans that they've gone through Parliament include no mechanism for additional resourcing. So I'd like to hear from kind of Rob, how much does a local neighbourhood plan cost, and where does that money come from? Is an interesting question. And I think it really comes back to Joe's bit as well, is certainly where I'm based here in kind of Edinburgh. Edinburgh is one of the most educated cities in the UK. Something like 70% of the working population are educated to degree level. You can't go into a neighborhood without coming across a superannuated architect or surveyor or lawyer. And usually there's a high court judge sitting there just to keep everybody kind of on their toes. So it's actually a very, very well-informed, able community. And in fact, actually much of Edinburgh exists because the community were able to resist local authority kind of plans going forward. But there is a concern that it's only in places like Edinburgh or in well-to-do middle-class environments who will get the real benefit from a local place plan. And communities kind of in deprived, the east side of Glasgow or in Dundee or Paisley or in some parts of the West Coast simply will not have the ability within themselves to drive through a plan, and they won't have a resource given to them from government to make it happen.
I think that's a really key point. I'd like to open it. I'm going to be daring here and try and open this up to the panel as a key question. How do we get those resources to those people in deprived areas who need to be able to develop a local a neighbourhood plan or a plan for their local area to make sure they can get the resources they require? I'd love to know what thoughts you have. I don't know who wants to dive in first on this one.
Can I do really quickly, because this is something I've always been passionate about, is we need to convince the powers that be that designing good places and maintaining good places is resource intensive. You do not get good town, cities, good conservation on the cheap. And we've all been remiss at not really kind of driving that kind of agenda forward. We know that most politicians engage with the planning process through their constituents. So somehow we need to weaponize the interest that all of the communities have in what's in their neighborhood to get the resources kind of into it, so that we can do the things that people want to be done.
Yeah, excellent. I think that's an excellent point. I don't know if we can build on that, but Rob, yes, was it you?
Yeah, I'd say in terms of what they cost at the moment, obviously there's an awful lot of volunteer time, and that's a cost that we're not counting. It's huge. I think the amount of time it takes for one neighbourhood plan, and some never get there. Some do hit hurdles, and sometimes those hurdles are historic environment hurdles that we put in their way, or we at least uphold, and that can actually wear things down to the point where they end the process. But the government have made funding available in this country via locality, so they have an arm's length body who distribute that, and they do it on an annual funding round. So every April, community groups are invited to apply for more funding to keep their plan going, and they do it in tranches of about £7,000 to £10,000 at a time, to basically for the use of employing consultants to help you with tricky bits. So if you need your character assessment done or your historic environment assessment done, that's what that funding is for. And then because strategic environmental assessment is such a complex and difficult thing for communities to do, that again is something that's funded on a centralized basis via locality through a single contractor that's been pre-booked. So the community don't have to go out to tender or anything for that. They just go to that pre-selected organization. Now that's quite bad side to it, that we don't see lots of competition for that work, and it kind of becomes very formulaic for that organization. But it has meant that over the last 6 years we've been able to improve the quality of the work they do, because we're so frequently going back to them with the same comments. So there's a benefit at one level to doing that. So there is funding that the government provide on each one, and I would say probably each neighbourhood plan over its lifetime must receive around about £20,000 to £24,000 to get it there. I worked on one in Wolverhampton before Historic England Days that cost £70,000 in terms of money that the government, the council put into it, Wolverhampton City Council put into it to support a community council to do that. And that was for a very, very large urban area. So it wasn't central Wolverhampton, but it was 8 square kilometres, 8 square miles of suburb, big area, 20,000 households. So that was expensive, but that was required to get that community engagement and outreach, and there was a lot of outreach that went on through that process. Now, the government here have a new scheme that they've just set up to target hard-to-reach communities, and that is currently out as a funding round, inviting people to apply. And I think it's based on district councils applying to support their communities, or city councils probably. And that's in the order of millions of pounds at the moment that they are putting into that.
If I may dare, I'm going to go to Joe in a second, because I know I haven't given Joe a chance to say anything. But if I may add on that, I've Surrey County Council bid for funding for local listing, and we received it. We're absolutely delighted. At the end of November, we put that in because I knew about it. We had the time to do it because we was that desperate to get it. But I think there's one thing between having the funding available and having the time and resources to apply for it, and working out a whole plan for what you need to do from one place to another. And some places have the volunteers and the time to put all that together, which is going back to the point we were saying earlier on, and some places don't. And I think that's something that the powers that be need to be aware of. And the only way, from my perspective, is that there needs to be those resources put in place for someone to apply for that funding in the very first place. And that's not just in deprived areas. I know some authorities which are relatively well off that just don't have the resources to put it in. And the only people that are getting anywhere are the parish and town councils, who have the volunteer time and resources to do stuff. They've probably got more expendable capital than the actual local planning authority. But there we are. Joe, I can see you're aching to jump in here.
Well, I think it's very interesting that you say that, Tris, because obviously if Surrey itself is struggling, and how does a local community even begin to start thinking about this, or even know where to look, for example, with locality, to know that this funding is available. But I think it's worth bearing in mind, and I think perhaps we can get lost from this, is that for ordinary people, most ordinary people, planning isn't sexy. It's not something they think, oh, what am I going to spend my spare time doing? I know, I'll do a local plan. That'd be really fun, won't it? It's a hard sell. I think I think it's danger of losing sight about that. And I think in a way, we're almost looking to get people, in my view, we're looking to get people involved at the wrong point, because in my experience, people get passionate where there's a building or something they care about is and there's a threat to it or change. And yet at that point, although people can comment on planning consultations, there's not very much real voice for the community in those decisions. And I think there's a mismatch between where people are interested and people want to get involved, and where the system wants to get involved and people aren't interested.
One thing I just want to go back to that Terry, you mentioned earlier on about local listing. You said you don't have local listing in Scotland. Is it something you, from what you're aware of, see as useful as a heritage protection for a range of assets that are identified on the list? Or do you think it should be something that's automatically done without having to have a specific list that identifies every building or site that should be identified as being significant? Do you think perhaps it should be up to the planners or someone, or the conservation officer?
It's a really good question, and we always have that debate: do we have too many listed buildings, kind of anyway? The way how I could have approached that, in a sense, is I think we underuse area-based conservation and area-based conservation designations poorly. Certainly, kind of I think in Scotland we do, and conservation area designation or design landscapes rather provide, I think, a much more powerful approach to managing areas of historic and architectural kind of interest without necessarily having to have this kind of detailed list of all the different kind of aspects to it. And we could perhaps simplify things by thinking more in an area-based kind of approach going forward. The difficulty that I see with the local listing of introducing it into a place where it doesn't have the history to it is just for the point like Joe was saying, is that where people come into the system, they're looking for something to help them protect something of value to them and their neighborhood in it. So, you know, the listed building, because it actually has acts of parliament in behind it, people have this expectation that the listing will help the community protect an asset that they care for. Whereas to have something which you know has the same name but doesn't have that element of protection behind it, you know, it's more of an acclamation as opposed to a control mechanism, can create, I think, a number of kind of issues going through that process, and it's probably in that which is why there's been a greater resistance in Scotland to kind of introducing the concept than anything else.
We're getting towards the end of the session, and I want to make sure we can end on a positive note, and what we should be aiming for, what we should be looking at, really, to enable communities to have their impact, but also campaigning organisations as well. One of the questions I've had in was, can neighbourhood plans propose Article 4s? Rob, is that possible? My understanding was no, but they could perhaps suggest it, and if not, perhaps that's something that could be looked at.
Yeah, I mean, they can certainly identify areas where they would be desirable, and they can collect the evidence for it. We do have a community-driven Article 4 direction in South Oxfordshire, which I think is East Hagbourne, and was produced by the IHBC's past president, our much loved and missed Eddie Booth, on behalf of the community. So the community actually did the work. They wrote up the report, and then presented that to the council, and they adopted it. But if on the basis that the community was saying, we will abide by these rules collectively, we're just worried that if we sell our houses, someone might not, and so they introduced them. So I think that's something that can happen, and would be, and is something that can be identified as desirable through a neighbourhood plan, but it does rely on that partnership approach of the district council then actually doing it. And something I think in terms of local listing, and it'd be interesting to think about Scotland and the community right to buys that came with the Land Act, is what we have here now with the community assets of community value, which are different from local listings, but could cover the same things. So you can make something locally listed in your neighbourhood plan and say it has heritage value, and then you can also say that makes it an asset of community value. When it comes to selling it, if the owner wants to sell it, they then have to give the community 6 months to come up with the goods if they want to take it on themselves. And that could be something that works in a more urban way in Scotland, and that would be quite interesting to think about, taking on the experience of having the crofters right to buy and saying, well, let's use that in an urban area. What we haven't seen is the alternative in this country of the community trying to buy larger pieces of landscape. I'd be interested to see if they bought the battlefield site at Lewes, if the owner ever wanted to sell that.
Joe, obviously I know the Victorian Society have been campaigning for a long time. I'm sure there's a huge range of things that you'd like to see done in the planning system to give communities and campaigning organisations more of a voice. Here's your whatever 2 minutes. What do you think we need?
Oh, well, I could do 2 hours probably. I think the key one, and unfortunately it's going contrary to the current mood, is permitted development, because especially permitted development demolition, because that just negates the whole opportunity for any kind of community campaign or have any say over what's going on. And we're increasingly seeing some really interesting buildings being lost to permitted development demolition. But also, just touching on the asset community value, I actually led a campaign to save a pub and got it. It was being demolished, and I got it listed, and I got it nominated as an asset community value. But it's a real flaw in that mechanism, because the owner of the building can just set any sky-high unrealistic price, which means that it's just simply not viable for the community to buy it. So he said, oh, we want £1 million. So we just had to wait 6 months, and obviously only sold it for less than that to somebody else. So yeah, I think there's a lot of things that can be done, and I think it's a very interesting time. I think there's forces pulling in different directions at the same time. So I remain optimistic.
I'm aware also, slightly pretending you're saying it rather than me, is that am I right in saying that the Victorian Society have been suggesting that permitted development rights should be removed for locally listed buildings, or have I made that up?
No, you didn't make that up. Yeah, so, well, I drafted a letter for the Joint Committee of National Immunity Societies and the IHBC with one of the signatories. So we sent that to the Minister, because I think it's a really strange situation to be that government spending an awful lot of money on local listing, and yet they can be demolished under permitted development rights. So it doesn't seem to make much sense. So we're waiting for a response, so fingers crossed on that one.
I do think we're in for an interesting time going forward with local listing, and it's quite nice. I think that we've clearly got someone who's very interested in it, and I'm sure that the IHBC as an organisation will be very much willing to work with the MHCLG as well as part of their APPG, which to give a shout out to. Terry, obviously you've got the Scottish perspective, but more broadly, do you have any sort of closing comments on where you think we should be heading, what we should be doing, both in England and in Scotland, and much more widely? What is it that we should really be looking at?
I think that there's an awful lot of positive, right-minded thinking in some of the things that are coming up in local neighbourhood plans and the kind of place plans we're seeing, because they can begin. It doesn't need to kind of put in protection. It's about kind of shifting attitudes and beginning to kind of move communities into thinking a little bit more creatively about their environments as to what can and can't be done. So it doesn't have to be a protective plan, but it could be an enhancement plan. But I think in that is what we need to do is accept that they have to be resourced, and for them to then have a balance in communities that maybe struggle a little bit. Well, they need to have other organizations who can help them. And there is a network of bodies, whether they're community councils or whether they're civic associations like my own or a whole range that can be marshaled and mobilized to actually really help give a G up to kind of all of this. And I think we can use these local processes perhaps to fill the gaps that we're beginning to see from the national processes of kind of either retreating away from the regulation through PDR, or even when local development plans are expected, as they are now in Scotland, to have a shelf life of 10 years, which is just madness. You know, nobody can see beyond 2 years, let alone 10, and the role then that these more local based produced products could fulfill in those wider gaps could be really powerful.
Wonderful. Yeah. Well, I think that is going to bring us to an end. I might hear the voice of Sean in a second telling me that that's going to be it, unless we're allowed a couple more minutes. So I think I'll probably bring that to an end there. Just to say thank you very much to all three of you for being here today. Rob, for your excellent presentation. I hope that's going to convince a fair few people to get on with their neighbourhood plans or to visit some of our amazing heritage action zones, particularly those in the southeast. Terry, thank you very much for your Scottish perspective on the issue, and it's interesting to note that obviously local place plans are only just getting going in Scotland, and I'm sure when we are in Aberdeen next year, which hopefully we'll all be there in person, that we'll be able to hear a lot more about the excellent progress that's been made on those, and perhaps our English planning system can learn from it. And Joe, thank you very much for the perspective on a whole range of things, ranging from campaigning to local policy, and hopefully organisations like the Victorian Society will all be there to keep us in line and to put pressure on us to make sure that we're looking after the wonderful range of historic buildings we have in this country.